Alrighty, looks like we do have Ruth set up with her laptop. And I will go ahead and introduce her as our next speaker. Ruth, or Ruth Fuchss, who is a computational linguist turned technical writer. She's worked at IBM, Nordic Semiconductor, Canonical, and now Atronica, and she's used, maintained, and developed documentation tooling based on DITA, Doxygen, and RST and Sphinx, mainly in a Doxys code setup. So here's Ruth with the right tool for the job.
Okay, so say you can start over with your documentation, and you can build it up from scratch. Or maybe, you're just starting something completely new. You need to pick some kind of tool for that. And how do you do that? Where do you start? How do you know it's actually the right tool for that? So Andrea already gave a bit about my background. So I've written both hardware documentation and software documentation in different setups. I started actually working in a DITA CMS, then later in a more or less homegrown docs as code DITA approach, even though at that time docs as code wasn't really a term that was used so much, but it's pretty much what we set up and worked with. Then software documentation mostly in Doxygen at first, and then Sphinx later, and then getting my hands more and more dirty, looking actually into Sphinx, extending it, and setting up tool chains, automatic builds, and so on. So got a bit of experience in the tooling. And now, about a year ago, I started with Atronica, which is a hardware company. And as most hardware companies, their docs are a little bit, let's just call it old-fashioned. It's mainly Word files, InDesign files, they're stored in SharePoint. And when I came in, I had pretty much free reins to modernize this because they were very painfully aware of all the drawbacks of the setup that they had. So, of course, Word is not really a good tool to reuse content. So all reuse, for example, was done by just copying stuff from one file and copying it into another file. And of course, that would get out of sync very, very quickly. And I was brought in with the intention to actually modernize this. So my main question was, what is the right tool to use for that? And how do I know this is the right tool? First question now is, what is actually a tool? Or what do I mean when I speak about a tool here now? Because there's so many documentation tools out there. Here's just like a brain dump, by no way exhaustive, just a list of tools that seems very overwhelming. So if you look at that and try to pick the right tool for yourself or for the documentation that you're trying to set up, it's really hard to know what you're looking at. It gets a little bit more manageable when you try to actually categorize these tools a little bit. First one I'm highlighting here is actually different markup languages, so the syntax or the format in which you write. So something like Markdown or XML. When you write that, you then need some kind of engine to transform what you have written into an output, like Sphinx, like the DITA OT, just as examples. And if you have some kind of text-based format, you need a text editor to do this, like Emacs or Visual Studio, Notepad++. But there's also specialized editors. For example, here, ArborText or Oxygen, they would be specialized editors for DITA or XML in general. And they will also come with an engine integrated. So you can basically just click a button and get the output automatically. Surprisingly similar, something like Word or InDesign. There you have what you see is what you get editor. So you just point and click to format things. So you don't really care about the markup language underneath. But still, it's going to be stored. Your formatting is going to be stored in some kind of syntax. Internally, you don't need to care about it. But you also have this one button that you can click, and then you will get magically some kind of output out of it. Then, once you have your documentation output, you need to get it out to the user somehow. There's different ways of doing that. Read the Docs, for example, will let you build your documentation and then host it for the user. If you have an approach like a wiki or a forum, you have an integrated editor and can just save your content in there, and it'll be automatically be published for the user. Or you could have something more advanced, like a content delivery platform, like, for example, Fluid Topics or Zoomin, which will actually ingest your documentation output, process it and parse it, and then present it again to the user. So different ways of actually getting your documentation out. Then, not sure if that's visible, I marked SharePoint and Git now, used a bit of a bad color here, but those are then systems where you can store your files, and also something like Jenkins or Bamboo, which would be build servers where you can actually run your transformations. Then going a little bit in a different direction. Now, up to now, we mostly talked about how you actually write your documentation, like, well, not physically, but digitally, but you know what I mean. Then there's also the question, how do you structure your content? And there's some content frameworks that you can use for that, like Diataxis or also Ditta. Ditta I marked in green here because it's not only a content framework, it's at the same time a syntax, so it would be both blue and yellow. That's why I put it in green down here. And then finally, or not finally, actually, you have a few checkers, something like Grammarly or Veil, that you can run on your documentation to check very different things. You can check for typos, you can check the syntax of what you're writing, you can check the grammar. And now, finally, you have different doc methodologies that you can use, like Docs as Code or CCMS, for example. And looking at this now, well, you might have a bit of a better idea of what tools there are, but it still doesn't really make it that easy because you still need to figure out what you can combine of those tools. Because some of those you can mix, others you can't. If you look, for example, at Sphinx and Markdown, that is a combination that is very common that you could use. In theory, you could also combine your Word files and store them in a Git repository if you wanted to. Might not make much sense, but it's totally possible. No problem with that. But if you then think about maybe editing your InDesign file in a text editor, you will probably run into a lot of problems. Or if you want to store your CCMS output on Read the Docs, that's probably also not going to work. So here it's very important to look at what you can actually mix and what will give you problems. And it's very easy to start comparing apples and oranges in this case, because when I first started, I pretty much asked myself, should I go for Ditta or should I go for a Docs as Code approach? And it took me a while to realize that this is not an alternative, because you can totally do Ditta in a Docs as Code approach. And so there I was actually comparing apples to oranges and trying to decide between the two, which didn't make any sense in this case. And what helped me then was when things started falling into place, was when I realized that actually the stock methodologies, the ones that I marked last, mostly Docs as Code and CCMS, those are really a bit a decision on a different level. It's like a very central decision that you need to make. Not necessarily the first you can take. I mean, Ian talked about this earlier as well, that this is kind of one of those things that is very hard to decide because both options could be right. But it's a bit on a different level. And when you have that decision, it might be easier to decide on the specific tools you want to use underneath, because it'll already limit a bit of what you can do. But it might not be the first thing that you can decide. Just a quick overview over those different methodologies, if you're not familiar with them. Docs as Code, the main idea is that you would use the same tools that you either are using for code or could be using for code for your documentation as well. So you would basically work with text files that are stored somewhere in a version control system, and you would combine them in some way to form documents, and then you would use the same review processes that you're using for code reviews, or that your development team might be using for code reviews, to work with your documentation as well. And this gives you full control over what you can do in there and a lot of flexibility, because basically if you can program it, you can also do it in your documentation. So you can customize a lot of things there. But of course that comes with really high complexity, or it can, depending on how you set it up. The CCMS, on the other hand, is a specialized tool that is actually made for documentation purposes. So you're not reusing the stuff that actually is made for code, but you're also using it for documentation. But this one is really specific for documentation. And it's usually a bit of a black box, so you don't really know, or you don't need to know at least, what is happening behind the scenes. But you just use it, and it's just made for what you are supposed to do. You can do some tweaks, of course, but you don't need to have a lot of configuration to get it working. So it's really streamlined for documentation work, lets you focus on the content instead of the actual tooling, so you don't really need to think that much about other things that really might not be part of your job, and gives you also control of the documentation. I actually wanted to split up those pros and cons into a pro section and a con section, but noticed very quickly that this is simply impossible, because it really is a mindset question, how you see documentation, how your documentation is set up and who's actually working on your documentation, and also a bit on the company culture, who is responsible for documentation, who is going to contribute. So anything that can be a pro for one person might be a con for another one. And so it's a bit of a mindset question. And that's also why it's maybe not the first thing that you can decide when you try to figure out what you're doing. Now, how do you actually decide on any kind of tooling? On the next couple of slides, I'm going to give you loads and loads of questions that you can ask yourself to try and figure out your requirements. I'm actually not going to go into all of them in detail now, because that would be way too much. But if you want to discuss more, just come to me and talk to me. I have some ideas about all of them. I'm just going to go into the ones that were most important for my personal decision in my case. And also keep in mind that I had to put them in some order, of course, but that does not mean that they are in order of relevancy, because this will be very, very different depending on your use case and your documentation. And something that is really important for my documentation might be completely irrelevant for you. What is important, though, is to figure out what are your non-negotiables. So what do you absolutely need for your documentation? In my case, there was PDF support, because as I already said, I work in a hardware company. Our documentation at the moment is all in PDF. We need those PDFs. They are not going to go anywhere for certification. They are just required. They need to be stored. We don't have a choice to go away from PDFs. And that also prevented me from kind of going blindly for my favorite tool, because that would have been Sphinx, because I'm most familiar with it. And while Sphinx can absolutely do decent PDFs, no question about that, it's not made for PDFs. It's made for HTML documentation, and in addition, you can generate some PDFs from the same sources. And those will look decent, but it's, as I said, it would be a compromise to go for Sphinx. And since that is one of my non-negotiables, it was very clear from the start that I'm not going to compromise on that. And so what I actually ended up with in the end was the choice between either AsciiDoc or DITA, and as I said before on the last slide, either Docs Code or CCMS. And that's where I went in with all my questions. So first area of questions is the team, and first of all, the contributors. Who does actually write the documentation? Is it the tech writer? Is it the developers? Is it both of them combined? In my case, it's actually only the tech writer. Of course, the developers are going to give the input for it, but they were not allowed to contribute, mainly because they would always mess up the formatting of the Word files. So yeah, I totally understand that. But of course, it meant that they were willing to contribute, but they could not contribute in this case. So that was something to keep in mind. How big is the team? In my case, I'm the single writer. So yeah, that really should make it easy, because it's only me that is affected by this decision. And there's also no plan to grow the team anytime soon. So that means really I can just decide I'm the stakeholder, no problem. Except we know that if the team is not going to grow, the amount of documentation is still going to grow, and we're all very aware of that. And that means that I will need to involve the developers more and more. So it's actually not only me I need to think about, but I also need to think about how can I get the developers to contribute willingly and easily. And that, again, is, of course, a very big plus for a Docs Code approach, because they are developers, so they know Git, they will have no problem going for a Docs Code approach. That leads us to the expertise part and the questions, what skill does the team have? Yep, totally true what I just said. I talked to the software developers. they pretty much started converting all their internal docs to ASCII doc when I first mentioned that, before I had even made a final decision, because they were totally on board. Awesome. But as I said, I work in a hardware company. So we have this one small software team, then we have this huge hardware team. We have the product management team that is responsible for signing off and reviewing all the documentation. And we have the project team, which will create project documentation for each customer. And none of those used Git usually. So some of them might be familiar with it, but it's not anything that I can kind of say that, okay, everybody knows Git in this company. So for all those teams, actually a CCMS might be the better choice, just because it's easier if they just want to add a page to just click somewhere and write, as they used to do in Word, write their input. They would just do it in a CCMS then. Reviewing stuff, you have a very good comparison feature usually in a CCMS, so you can just see what has changed and can then click the button and everything's done. But nowadays, most Git interfaces or Git front ends do have a pretty decent web interface as well. So it doesn't mean that because not everybody knows Git, I have to exclude the docs as code approach. Because we can still do docs as code and have people use the web interface to do their reviews and to maybe even add a file or change a file. That again is a point for ASCII doc though, over DITA, because if you're thinking about a web interface and like an editor that doesn't have any specialized support, you really don't want to write XML in there, while ASCII doc is a lot more human readable. Also, if you're comparing it and you're comparing XML files, you will see a lot of weird things that will just distract you from what you really want to look at. So both is possible, both CCMS or docs as code, but ASCII doc has a bit of an advantage here over DITA. Then the next question would be who maintains the tool? And there are different options for that. Maybe you can do it yourself. Maybe you find somebody else in your company that can maintain the tool. Maybe a developer, maybe someone from IT. Or you maybe need to bring in an external contractor. And for this, you need to know what skills are actually required for the maintenance. And in this case, don't only think about the tool itself, because especially if you're looking for somebody in your company, they might not know any documentation tools. But if you think about Sphinx, for example, that is based on Python. So no problem at all if you need help there. You just grab the developer from the office next door and they will be able to help you. No problem about it. If you're thinking about ASCII doc, that is based on Ruby. Might be a little bit harder to find somebody. You will probably find somebody who is comfortable just figuring out the change if they don't know Ruby. But then if you're thinking about DITA and the DITA OT, that's based on XSLT. Good luck finding somebody in your company or even in anybody you know. You will probably need to go to an external contractor. Not necessarily a bad thing though, because they will be an expert. So they might actually be a lot better to work with than somebody in your company who's trying to figure out Ruby. So again, there's no answers, as I wrote in the abstract. I'm not going to give you any answers. I'm going to give you questions, and you need to figure out what is the best for your actual use case. Now, moving on to the documentation part. Let's first look at the content. First question I highlighted here is how consistent are your documents? And of course, how consistent do you want them to be? If you have very consistent documents, you might want to go for something or some format that enforces this consistency. So DITA might be a very good idea in this case, because it's quite rigid and you kind of need to force your content into this structure, but that will ensure that it's also gonna look quite consistent afterwards. So especially if you have several writers and very consistent documentation, DITA might be exactly the right tool for you. In my case, not necessarily, because we have hardware documentation for very different audiences, and we have software documentation in addition. So of course we could try and force them into the same format, but is that actually a good idea? Or does that help the content? Or do you focus more on the content and do whatever's the right thing to get your information across instead of forcing it into a very rigid schema? So in my case, the decision was, no, I will compromise on the consistency of the documents. They don't need to look all the same. I want to focus more on the content. And this, for me, was another point why there's not really a use for using Ditta. Because, of course, you can just ignore the rigidness and you can just use it in a way that works for you. But then why would you then go for Ditta? Next question, do you reuse content? And I think probably most documentation sets do reuse some kind of content. And simple reuse is pretty easy to do on most platforms if you just want to reuse a file or a topic. But if it gets more advanced and you might need something like conditional text or variables, like for a product name that you want to replace in some content that you reuse, then you actually need something a bit more advanced. So even plain Markdown cannot really do that. So you would need some extensions to go along to do that with Markdown. And yeah, Word or InDesign can't really do that anyway. But both Ditta can do it and AsciiDoc can do it. Restructured text can also do it. And there it's a bit of a matter of taste, which kind of formatting you like best for this stuff. Now, looking at the delivery, I already said, for us, it's at the moment only PDFs, but I also want to publish HTML documentation in the future. That makes it pretty easy because most tools that can do PDFs can also do HTML. If you maybe exclude Word, which probably can also do HTML, but you probably don't want to publish that anywhere. If it's the other way around and you have HTML documentation and you might want to add PDFs in the future, that's something you should keep in mind when you choose your tool, so that you don't end up with something that really is almost impossible to create PDF out. Then the next one, how important is the look and feel? And this actually isn't really relevant when you're thinking about Ditta and AsciiDoc because both of them are doing it the same way. But if you're thinking about something like Word or InDesign compared to other tools like Ditta or AsciiDoc, I'm a big proponent of splitting the content from the presentation so that you can, when you're writing your content, you don't need to think about how it looks in the end. So you might want to say that I want a list here, but you don't think how that list should be formatted. That is something that will come in the transformation afterwards, and you don't want to worry about it when you're writing it. And this will give you consistency in the output because everything is always going to format it the same way. You just do a little markup in your content and don't worry about anything else. However, if you are very concerned or somebody else in your company is very concerned about the aesthetics of your documentation, and if maybe an image shows up on the bottom of page 1 or at the top of page 2, that is something you can't really control in this kind of approach because you are not thinking about how it's going to be presented when you're writing your content. So in this case, something like InDesign might be actually a better choice for you because there you have the control to put a picture somewhere else and not leave it up to the transformation on where it actually ends up. Then looking at the implementation, and first of all, the infrastructure. Make sure to check what other tools are used in the company. Is there anything that you can piggyback on? So is there already some kind of DevOps in place that you can reuse? Do their developers maybe have some documentation builds, internal documentation builds set up? Because it's easier to use something that is already in use and make people come on board than introducing something completely new. Because if you do that, it's going to be you might have a hard time actually making people use this. So you could, of course, introduce a Linux tool if everybody is in a Windows environment, but people will not accept it, most likely. Of course, the big question is about the budget. And this is mainly a question for Docs as Code versus CCMS. Docs as Code, usually you can do in a free or affordable way using open source tools, while the CCMS is going to be a cost factor because you need to buy the tool, buy the licenses, and get it implemented. But then, if you're going for the Docs as Code and maybe going with something like Ditta, you also need to keep in mind that you should probably invest in a good editor. And especially for Ditta, there aren't really any free editors out there that you can use and that are good to work with. So you would probably need to factor in some cost for that. And if you're not the one to set it up, and you might need to get an external contractor to set up your Docs as Code approach, that will also include some costs. So in this case, you might already be at the same cost of getting a CCMS. So that is important to take into account. Another aspect regarding the budget, of course, is also how fast are you going to get it done. And this is something that probably depends a bit on your company culture, what is easier to do. If you can just throw together a proof of concept with free open source tools and show you this is how we can do the documentation in the future, that's probably quick and easy to get a thumbs up then. Might be more difficult to actually get an approval for a CCMS. Or it might not. It really depends on how your company ticks. So in my case, I could have gotten the budget for a CCMS. I did go for the Docs as Code approach in the end, just because I felt it's a lot easier to just get started. And you don't need to have it all planned out. You just throw together a proof of concept, show it, and people are happy and say that, yep, just go for it. So it's both a budget thing and a time thing. When you're then actually getting started, one thing to think about is if you already have documentation in place. So if you are starting from scratch, of course, that is not anything that's going to be relevant for you. If you already have something, first question would be, do you want to make a clean cut and say everything that you had before stays in the old format, and now, from now on, you're going to start with your new tools? Or do you actually want to migrate things? For me, it was a bit of a mixture between the two. For the ones that, whenever I'm going to do a significant update to a document, I'm going to convert it to the new format, because I don't want to work in Word. But if it's just a number somewhere, I can probably do it quicker than transforming it. Then, of course, look into you can actually automate this process. And again, this is pretty easy nowadays. So I found out that with Pandoc, I can convert Word documents to ASCII-Doc and probably also to DITA without much pain. I will need to do some manual cleanup, but that is not really because Pandoc does anything wrong, but because the Word documents are never formatted correctly, just because they are Word documents. And then you will need to do, a bit of manual cleanup, and then you need to split it up into separate files. Or in ASCII-Doc, you actually don't need to do that step. But no matter if you want to split it up or not, that's something that also can easily be automated with a script. And now, looking a bit into the future, that's the last set of questions that I have. Short term, how difficult is it to onboard all your contributors? For a CCMS, that's probably quite easy, because the only thing they need is a user account in your CCMS, and the rest should be hopefully intuitive to use. But then user accounts might be coupled to licenses, so you might only want to give user accounts to those that actually contribute, which means every time somebody new comes in, you need to give a new user account and so on. It might increase the cost. So it might not be that easy, especially also if you have external contributors. Can you actually give them a user account for your internal tool, or is that going to cause a problem? For a Docs as Code approach, people will need to install the toolchain on their computers, which might be an issue depending on how restrictive your computer setup is or IT setup is. But then again, as I mentioned before, you can probably do a lot through the web interfaces as well. Which also goes to the next question, how difficult is it to do a one-off change? So say you're on vacation and suddenly somebody needs to change this one number in a document right away and it cannot wait for you. Can somebody just jump in without knowing Git? Or do they kind of need to work together so somebody can tell you how to do things? CCMS, again, as long as they have a user account, they will probably be fine. Docs as Code, if they don't know Git, it might be a bit challenging. In my case, what I did was actually write up a long user guide. This is where you click in the interface, and it will then leave the pull request in an open state and maybe in a messy state, but that's something I can clean up afterwards. They can do the changes, they can get the preview, and can get that document published without problems. So it's possible. CCMS might be the easier approach, but Docs as Code definitely works. And now, looking into the long-term outlook, will you still be happy with your tool in 5 years? And actually, this is the thing, I'm not 100% sure. Mainly this question about Docs code and CCMS. So ASCII-Doc and DITA, I'm pretty sure ASCII-Doc is the right way to go for my purpose. Docs code or CCMS? Not sure. I'm going for the Docs code right now because it's the easiest to get started with. And we're also not losing anything by going for that. Because next question, how much work would it be to switch tools later? Not really a lot. We're not going to lose anything because there are CCMSs out there that are based on ASCII-Doc, or not ASCII-Doc, but DocBook, which is equivalent. So moving our documentation to ASCII-Doc now is no problem at all. It's definitely going to be a step forward. And if in a couple of years we decide that we actually want to go for the CCMS approach, because it will involve more contributors, we can still do so. So it's a step into the right direction. And so I'm actually pretty sure that I'm still be happy with that decision in 5 years, even though we might be ending up with a different tool. Okay, and now I'm out of time and out of questions. So anybody has any answers, let me know.
Thank you. You got some kudos in a comment on Slido, and kudos from me as well for condensing a lot of information that can be very overwhelming into what can seem like an ecosystem that can be managed. So thank you again for that. We also got some questions about accessibility, and I think there was one person who had mentioned, for example, having some problems not being able to Zoom with their DITA tool, and we're wondering if you've managed to consider accessibility as part of your criteria.
Not necessarily for the tooling itself, but for the output, of course, you need to think. There, again, it goes a bit into the semantic markup versus unstructured content. Because if you have unstructured content, it's usually less accessible than structured content. If you have any kind of markup, it's usually, if you have a screen reader and so on, that they know what to read. So in this case, yes. For the tooling, actually, I have not considered that.
Good question, though. Yeah, as you said, lots of questions. Maybe one more question before we go to lunch. Have you had any problems getting consensus regarding what you referred to as non-negotiables, and perhaps any reluctance from team members who didn't want to let go of their attachments to certain tools?
Of course. First, the comment I got from the hardware team was like, okay, so who's going to maintain this tool, and how can I get my fonts that I have in Word files set up?
My fonts.
Yes, it was very specific. And actually, that was also an accessibility question now thinking about it, because they were like, I have my specific fonts that I want in the Word document because they are easier to read. And in this case, I think I could convince them quite quickly that it's very easy to have some kind of template in ASCII-Doc that will give them their fonts, the ones that they want. And of course, also that they can still give the input in a Word document in the way that they were used to. That does not necessarily mean that we will use it for the public documentation, but we weren't doing that before either.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm sorry, I was glancing at some more questions. There was another accessibility-related question with regards to the PDF output. This is actually a protocol I'm not familiar with, WCAG, and compliance with that. Is that something you're familiar with, or?
No, sorry.
Okay, me neither. And we have a question from John. Have you found it challenging to get a high-level view of the content that you own? Oops.
Definitely, and I still don't really have that. I know that we have a lot of documentation, but also putting it all into the same system is going to make it a lot easier to actually get an overview of this documentation. But having a bunch of Word files everywhere makes exactly that part very difficult to get a full overview over everything that there is.
Okay, I do think that's all the time we have for questions, but now we can go ahead and break for lunch. And again, thank you, Ruth, for your presentation.